The summer heat weighed down the neighborhood, thick and oppressive, making every sound seem slow and distant. Mr. Carson climbed the stairs to the Johnson family's apartment, clutching the folded eviction notice between his fingers like a declaration of war. His polished shoes scraped against the cracked concrete steps, and he muttered under his breath at the peeling paint and rusted railings. In his mind, the place was long overdue for new tenants, ones who wouldn't cause him trouble or make him uncomfortable every time he saw them. He stopped at the door of apartment 3B, straightened his tie, and rapped sharply on the wood with 3 deliberate knocks. The door opened a moment later, and Mrs. Johnson stood in the doorway, her expression calm, but the caution in her dark eyes was unmistakable. She wore a simple house dress, her hair tied back neatly, as if she had just been preparing lunch for her children. The faint smell of fried plantains drifted from inside, along with the low hum of a television. A toddler peeked out from behind her leg, his thumb tucked firmly in his mouth. "Mr. Carson," Mrs. Johnson greeted him, her voice polite but measured. "What can I do for you?" Without so much as a smile, Carson raised the folded eviction notice between 2 fingers like it was a verdict handed down from on high. His lips twisted into a tight, self-satisfied smirk. "This," he said, shoving the paper forward, "is your eviction notice. You've got 2 weeks. That's all the time you've got left." Mrs. Johnson blinked, her expression shifting from calm politeness to confusion. She took the paper slowly, unfolding it with steady hands, as if hoping the words inside would change by the time she opened it fully. "2 weeks?" she repeated, her brows furrowing. "But we've paid our rent on time. Every month." Carson shrugged, his indifference as heavy as the heat pressing down on the street outside. "Doesn't matter," he said, a smug edge creeping into his tone. "There've been complaints, and you've been late before." Mrs. Johnson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she just stared at the man standing on her doorstep, as if weighing the weight of his words against the years her family had lived quietly in the building. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the lights in the hallway, every neighbor who came and went. And she also knew, deep down, that Carson's so-called complaints were nothing more than a flimsy excuse. "We were late once," she said, her voice still steady, though there was an edge of steel beneath it. "That was last year, 2 days late, and we paid the fee. You know that." Carson's lips curled into a dismissive smile, as if the details didn't matter to him in the slightest. "It's not up for discussion, Mrs. Johnson," he said coldly. "The decision's been made. You've got 2 weeks to move out." Mrs. Johnson's grip tightened on the notice, her knuckles going white, but her expression remained calm. There was no panic, no begging, just a long, measured breath. She knew what men like Carson expected: tears, pleading, submission, and she was determined not to give him the satisfaction. Behind her, the little boy shifted closer, clutching her leg tighter. The faint sound of a spoon clinking against a plate came from inside the apartment, where her teenage daughter, Tia, was finishing her lunch. For a brief second, Mrs. Johnson thought about calling her husband at work, but she knew what he would say. He'd be furious, ready to pack their things just to get away from this situation. But Mrs. Johnson had no intention of leaving. Not like this. "We're not going anywhere," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Carson's smug expression flickered for the briefest moment, a flash of frustration crossing his face as if he hadn't expected her to stand her ground so easily. He cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "It's not up to you," he snapped, the cool facade slipping just slightly. "You'll be out of here whether you like it or not." Mrs. Johnson tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a calm intensity that made Carson take a small step back. 2 weeks won't be enough," she said softly, folding the notice with care and placing it on the small table just inside the doorway. "And you know it." Carson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had dealt with plenty of tenants over the years. Most of them folded at the first sign of trouble. They argued, they cried, they packed their things and left without a fight. But Mrs. Johnson? She wasn't flinching. For the first time, Carson felt a flicker of discomfort. Something about her quiet defiance unnerved him, made him feel as though the ground beneath his feet wasn't quite as solid as he had believed. He forced a laugh, a hollow, empty sound. "Suit yourself," he said, turning abruptly on his heel. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Mrs. Johnson watched him descend the steps, her hands resting calmly at her sides. She stood in the doorway long after Carson's footsteps had faded into the distance, her heart beating steadily in her chest. The eviction notice sat on the table, untouched and unread. Mrs. Johnson knew exactly what it said. 2 weeks to leave, no explanations needed, just an order to vacate the home they had made for themselves. But leaving wasn't an option, not this time. As she closed the door behind her, she whispered to herself, "We'll see about that." Mrs. Johnson stood in the living room, the eviction notice still clutched in her hand, her mind racing. The weight of Carson's arrogance lingered like the stale air in the apartment, but she pushed the frustration deep down. This was their home, and no piece of paper would change that, not without a fight. She turned, her calm demeanor cracking just slightly as she glanced around the space that had held years of memories. The old leather couch where her children curled up on movie nights, the framed family photos on the walls, the little scuffs on the coffee table from her son Daniel's toy cars. All of it felt heavier now, as though the apartment itself knew they were being pushed out. This wasn't just 4 walls. This was home. "Mark," she called toward the hallway, her voice steady but strained. "Can you come here a second?" A moment later, Mr. Johnson emerged from their bedroom, wiping his hands on his jeans. He had just returned from work, still dusty from his construction shift, and the fatigue hung on him like a heavy coat. But when he saw the look on his wife's face, he knew something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, concern creasing his brow. Mrs. Johnson didn't say anything at first. She just held out the folded eviction notice, letting it speak for itself. Mr. Johnson took the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the bold words across the top. "Eviction notice. 14 days to vacate." His expression darkened with every word. "I knew it," he muttered, crumpling the notice slightly in his fist. "I knew Carson was looking for an excuse to kick us out." His voice was low but sharp, filled with anger that had been simmering for months. He paced the small living room, his boots thudding heavily against the worn floorboards. "This man's been waiting for a chance," he said, shaking his head in frustration. "I told you, Sarah. The way he looked at us, the way he talked to me when I fixed that busted pipe last month, like we were some kind of burden." Mrs. Johnson leaned against the dining table, arms folded, watching him pace. She knew he was right. Carson's disdain had been obvious, a tension they could feel in every brief interaction. Still, hearing her husband say it out loud made the weight of the situation feel even heavier. Suddenly, Tia appeared from the hallway, her teenage curiosity drawing her to the tension in the room. She stood at the doorway, her notebook clutched to her chest, sensing the seriousness of the moment. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. "Why does Mr. Carson want us to leave? We haven't done anything wrong." Her voice was soft but laced with confusion, and it made Mrs. Johnson's heart ache. How do you explain something like this to a 15-year-old? How do you tell your child that sometimes, no matter how hard you work, people will judge you by things you can't control, things you shouldn't have to change? Mrs. Johnson knelt in front of Tia, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "We haven't done anything wrong, baby," she said softly. "This isn't about us. It's about Mr. Carson. He's just looking for an excuse." Tia's face twisted with frustration. "But we pay the rent. Why does he care?" Mr. Johnson, still pacing, muttered under his breath, "He cares because we don't fit the kind of people he wants in his building." Tia's brows furrowed. "Because we're black?" Mr. Johnson stopped in his tracks, his fists clenched at his sides. "Yeah, baby girl, that's exactly why." The room grew heavy with the truth that none of them wanted to admit out loud, but there it was, ugly and undeniable. Tia hugged her notebook tighter, the confusion giving way to anger in her young eyes. "That's not fair," she whispered fiercely. "It's not fair." "No, it's not," Mrs. Johnson agreed, brushing Tia's arm gently. "But we won't let him get away with it." Mr. Johnson sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. Maybe we should just move, Sarah. We can't fight this. Not against him." His voice was low, defeated, as if all the energy he had left from the long day had drained out at once. Mrs. Johnson turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto him with quiet intensity. "No?" she said, her voice unwavering. Mr. Johnson looked at her, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Sarah, think about it. We can't afford to take him to court. And what if he makes things worse for us?" Mrs. Johnson stood slowly, straightening her back. She wasn't just tired, she was fed up. "We've been good tenants," she said, her voice firm. "We pay on time. We don't cause trouble. We shouldn't be forced out because he doesn't want us here." Mr. Johnson leaned against the wall, arms folded tightly across his chest. "And what if we fight and lose? Then what? We can't risk everything just to prove a point." Mrs. Johnson stepped closer, her eyes fierce with determination. "This isn't just about proving a point, Mark. It's about standing up for what's right. If we let him do this, what's stopping him from doing it to the next family, or the one after that?" Mr. Johnson shook his head, frustrated but knowing deep down that she was right. They had a right to be here, just like anyone else. Tia watched them both, her young face set with the same determination she saw in her mother. "So what are we going to do?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Johnson smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "We're going to fight," she said, "and we're going to win." Mr. Johnson sighed again, a mixture of exhaustion and reluctant acceptance. "You really think we can fight him?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Mrs. Johnson nodded. "We have to." Daniel, the toddler, wandered into the room, clutching his favorite toy truck. He looked up at his parents, unaware of the gravity of the moment, and tugged gently on Mrs. Johnson's dress. "Mama, hungry," he mumbled sleepily. Mrs. Johnson scooped him up into her arms, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "All right, baby. I'll get dinner ready." Mr. Johnson exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little as he crossed the room and placed a hand on his wife's arm. "I trust you," he said quietly. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Mrs. Johnson smiled, grateful for his support, even through his frustration and doubts. "Thank you," she whispered. Tia watched them both, a new spark of understanding lighting in her eyes. "We're not leaving, are we?" she asked. "No," Mrs. Johnson replied with quiet confidence. "We're not going anywhere." And with those words, the Johnson family stood united, ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, the weight of the eviction notice still lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. The Johnsons sat at the kitchen table, the edges of the paper frayed from being handled too many times. This was not just a legal notice. It was a threat, one that carried the power to rip them from their home and leave them stranded with nowhere to go. Mr. Johnson sat with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to the droning sound of Carson's office voicemail for the third time that morning. The automated voice reminded him to leave a message, but he knew it would be pointless. Carson wasn't interested in explanations or compromise. Still, he tried again, gripping the phone tighter. "Yeah, it's Mark Johnson," he said when the beep sounded. "We need to talk about this notice you sent us. My wife and I have been tenants here for years, and we've always—" The phone cut off with a sharp click, and Mr. Johnson slammed it down on the table. "Voicemail again," he muttered bitterly. No response. Mrs. Johnson, standing by the stove, stirred a pot of oatmeal slowly, her face unreadable. She knew this was coming. Carson wasn't going to give them a chance, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "He's not even pretending to listen," Mr. Johnson continued, his voice rising with frustration. He shoved the phone away, shaking his head. "It's like he's already decided. We don't belong here, so it doesn't matter what we say." Mrs. Johnson turned off the burner, placing the spoon on the counter. "I think that's exactly what he's doing," she said quietly, her voice calm but edged with determination. Mr. Johnson looked at her, his frustration boiling over. "Then what are we supposed to do, Sarah? He's got all the power. He's the landlord. He can evict us whenever he wants. What are we supposed to say to that?" Mrs. Johnson sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. "We don't need to say anything," she said softly. "He already knows what he's doing. This isn't about rent or complaints. This is about him wanting us out because we don't fit his idea of who should live here." Mr. Johnson rubbed his hands over his face, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "Maybe we should just start looking for another place, somewhere else, somewhere they'll leave us alone." Mrs. Johnson shook her head, her gaze steady. "No, we're not running, Mark. If we leave now, what message does that send to Carson, or anyone else like him?" He leaned back in his chair, letting out a bitter laugh. "And what happens if we stay? You think he's just gonna let this go?" Mrs. Johnson's eyes didn't waver. "No, but we're not staying for Carson. We're staying because this is our home. We've worked hard to build a life here, and I'm not going to let him take that away from us just because he thinks he can." Mr. Johnson ran a hand over his scalp, his frustration simmering just below the surface. "And what if we fight, Sarah? What if we fight and we lose? Then what?" Mrs. Johnson reached across the table and took his hand. "Then at least we'll know we did everything we could. I can't live with the idea of just walking away." For a moment the room fell silent except for the faint clinking of Daniel's spoon as he scraped the last of his oatmeal from his bowl. Tia sat quietly at the far end of the table, her head down, scribbling in her notebook, though her ears were clearly tuned in to her parents' conversation. Mr. Johnson exhaled heavily, looking down at their intertwined hands. He shook his head, words failing him. "I hate feeling this helpless, like there's nothing we can do." Mrs. Johnson squeezed his hand gently. "We're not helpless, Mark. We have each other, and we have David." Mr. Johnson gave a weary chuckle. "David? I hope your brother's as good as they say he is." Mrs. Johnson smiled softly. "He is, and he's not going to let Carson win." The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains in the Johnsons' living room, casting long shadows over the furniture. Mrs. Johnson sat at the edge of the couch, her phone cradled in both hands, scrolling through her contacts until her brother's name appeared. David Green. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the call button. It wasn't easy for her to ask for help, especially not from David. He had built a reputation in the city as one of the toughest civil rights lawyers around. taking on powerful institutions and winning cases that made headlines. His time was valuable. But Carson's eviction notice wasn't just unfair, it was personal. She needed David's help. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button and listened to the dial tone hum in her ear. It rang twice before his familiar voice came through, deep and steady, with a hint of warmth beneath the professionalism. "Sarah. Hey, what's going on?" Mrs. Johnson exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders just hearing his voice. David had that effect on people, calm, measured, and reassuring, like no matter how bad things seemed, he had everything under control. "David," she said, her voice carrying the weight of the past few days, "we need your help. Carson, the landlord, he's trying to evict us for no reason." She glanced at the eviction notice on the table, frustration tightening in her chest. "And I'm sure it's because of who we are." There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of David processing her words, taking them in without interrupting. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and filled with quiet determination. "All right," he said calmly. "Start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened." Mrs. Johnson ran a hand through her hair, gathering her thoughts. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to sound desperate, but the stress of it all was starting to wear her down. "It started a few days ago. Carson showed up at the door with an eviction notice. He gave us 2 weeks to move out, no warning. We've always paid on time, except once, and that was over a year ago. No complaints, no problems." David's voice remained level, but she could hear the underlying seriousness. "Did he give a reason for the eviction?" Mrs. Johnson shook her head, though she knew David couldn't see her. "Just some nonsense about complaints from the other tenants. But we know what this is really about." There was another brief pause, followed by the sound of papers rustling on David's end. Mrs. Johnson could imagine him already pulling out his legal pad, scribbling notes in his neat handwriting. "Sarah," he said firmly, "I need you to send me the eviction notice and any other paperwork you've got. I'll look into it right away." Mrs. Johnson closed her eyes, relief washing over her like a cool breeze on a stifling day. She knew she could count on David, but hearing him say it out loud made all the difference. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer now. David's tone softened, but the focus remained. "This isn't the first time I've seen a case like this, and it won't be the last. But listen to me. We're going to handle this. Carson doesn't get to bully you out of your home." Mrs. Johnson nodded, even though he couldn't see her. For the first time in days, she felt like they had a real chance. "I knew you'd help," she said, a small, grateful smile forming at the corners of her mouth. "Of course," David replied. "Your family, and more importantly, this isn't just about you and Mark. It's about making sure people like Carson know they can't get away with this." Mrs. Johnson could hear the passion in his voice now. David had always been like this, a fighter. Even when they were kids, he was the one who stood up to bullies, the one who spoke up when others stayed silent. He had turned that fire into a career, and now it was going to help her family. "Do you think we can win?" she asked quietly, the doubt creeping into her voice despite herself. David's response was swift and certain. "We're not just going to win, Sarah. We're going to make sure Carson never tries this with another family again. Now, send me everything you've got. I'll get my team on it today." Mrs. Johnson's heart lifted at his words, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. They weren't alone in this fight anymore. "I'll send it over now," she promised. "And David, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said, a touch of humor in his voice. We've still got a fight ahead of us, but you've got me in your corner, Sarah. We'll get through this." Mrs. Johnson smiled, the tension in her chest loosening just a little. "We always do." After hanging up the phone, she sat in the quiet living room for a moment, letting the sense of hope settle over her. It was still a long road ahead, but now they had something they hadn't had before: a plan, a fighter, and a way forward. She stood up and went to the dining table, gathering the eviction notice and the rent receipts she'd kept neatly filed in a drawer. She laid everything out, snapping clear pictures with her phone and sending them to David's email. Every piece of paper, every receipt, it all mattered now. When she finished, Mr. Johnson walked into the room, his face lined with exhaustion from another sleepless night. "Did you talk to David?" he asked, his voice edged with worry. Mrs. Johnson nodded, a spark of confidence in her eyes. "I did. He's going to handle it." Mr. Johnson let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, sinking down into one of the dining chairs. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. "And?" he asked, still cautious, as if afraid to hope too soon. Mrs. Johnson gave him a small but determined smile. "He's not just going to help us. He's going to make sure Carson regrets ever trying this." Mr. Johnson ran a hand over his face, nodding slowly. "Well, that's a start." Mrs. Johnson reached over, placing her hand gently over his. For the first time since Carson had shown up on their doorstep, she felt like they had the upper hand. "We're not doing this alone," she said quietly. "We have David now, and we're going to fight." Mr. Johnson gave her a tired but grateful smile. "Good," he said softly, "because I'm not ready to lose this place either." Mrs. Johnson leaned back, glancing around the apartment. It wasn't just a building. It was the place where their children were growing up, where their memories were made. And now, with David on their side, it wasn't going anywhere. "Neither am I," she whispered to herself. The phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down to see a message from David. "Got the paperwork. I'll get back to you soon." Mrs. Johnson smiled, the warmth of hope finally settling into her chest. They weren't going down without a fight. Not this time. David Green sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of legal files and documents. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the eviction notice and the papers Sarah had sent him the night before. This wasn't just about a landlord enforcing the rules. It was clear to David that Carson had used the eviction as a tool to push out the Johnsons for reasons that had nothing to do with rent. He scanned the notice, highlighting several sections with his yellow marker. The violations were obvious. Carson had provided flimsy reasons, complaints from other tenants, and a late payment from over a year ago. But David knew better. This was about something more insidious. This eviction wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Satisfied with his initial review, David reached for his phone and dialed his sister. On the other end of town, Sarah Johnson sat anxiously on her living room couch, her phone on the armrest, waiting. She picked it up on the first ring, her voice tight with nerves. "David." "Hey, Sarah," David said, his tone calm but focused. "I've gone through the papers you sent." "And?" Sarah asked, barely able to keep the worry out of her voice. David didn't waste time. "This isn't just unfair, it's illegal," he said firmly. "Carson's going to regret pulling this stunt." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The weight she had carried for the past few days seemed to lift just a little. "You're sure?" she asked, still cautious, as if the good news was too good to be true. David's voice was steady and full of confidence. "I'm sure. We've got him, Sarah. Carson broke multiple housing laws. The notice violates state eviction timelines, and there's enough evidence to suggest discrimination. This is a classic case of racial targeting. Sarah felt the corners of her mouth lift into a small smile. So, you think we can stop him? David's response came without hesitation. Not only will we stop him, but we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Sarah exhaled again, this time with a mixture of relief and hope. It felt like the first real breath she had taken in days. What do you need from us? Gather everything, David instructed. Any communication you've had with Carson or his office, emails, texts, receipts, anything that shows you've been good tenants. I'm going to subpoena his tenant records too. If there's a pattern, we'll find it. Sarah nodded, even though David couldn't see her. Okay, we'll get everything together. David's tone softened slightly, but it remained firm. I know this isn't easy, Sarah, but you're doing the right thing. We're going to win this. Thank you, Sarah whispered, emotion catching in her throat. You don't have to thank me, David said warmly. You're family. I've got your back. When the call ended, Sarah sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the conversation. David's confidence gave her something she hadn't had since the eviction notice arrived. Hope. For the first time, it felt like they weren't alone in this fight. They had someone on their side who knew the law and wasn't afraid to stand up to Carson. She stood up, walked to the kitchen, and sat down beside her husband, who was flipping absently through the newspaper. Mark glanced up at her, his expression still heavy with worry. What did David say? He said we've got a case, Sarah replied, her voice steadier than it had been in days. He found violations in the eviction notice, and he's going after Carson for racial discrimination. Mark leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. You think we can win? Sarah reached out, placing her hand over his. David thinks we can, she said. And if David thinks we can, I believe him. Mark gave a small nod, though the doubt hadn't entirely left his eyes. What do we need to do? We need to gather everything, Sarah said. Receipts, emails, anything that shows we've done our part. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, exhaustion etched into every movement. All right, let's get started. For the next few hours, they worked side by side, combing through old papers, organizing rent receipts, and printing emails. Every receipt and record felt like a lifeline, proof that they had been good tenants, proof that Carson had no reason to evict them except for his own prejudice. As the night wore on, the apartment grew quieter, with only the rustle of papers and the occasional sigh breaking the silence. Sarah felt the weight of the fight ahead, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a losing battle. They were doing this. They were standing up for themselves. Later that night, after they had tucked Daniel into bed and Tia had retreated to her room, Sarah and Mark sat quietly in the dim light of the living room. Mark leaned back on the couch, his eyes closed, the worry still etched into his features. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. David's going to take care of this, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Mark opened his eyes, giving her a small, tired smile. I hope so, he murmured. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. He will, she whispered back. We're not doing this alone anymore. Her phone buzzed softly on the coffee table, and she glanced down to see a message from David. Got the paperwork. I'll be in touch soon. Sarah smiled. For the first time in days, she felt like they had a chance. They weren't powerless. They had David in their corner, and with his help, they were going to fight. As she sat there in the quiet of their home, she knew one thing for certain. Carson had made a mistake, and now, with David's help, they were going to make sure he regretted it. Carson sat at the corner of a dim bar, cradling a glass of whiskey in one hand. The dim lights overhead flickered slightly, casting shadows over the worn-out booths. Across from him, two of his longtime friends, Bob and Jerry, sat nursing their drinks. They laughed easily, swapping stories of tenants they'd evicted and boasting about their latest business moves. To Carson, conversations like this were routine. Owning property meant dealing with tenants who didn't know their place, and tonight he had a fresh tale to share. "So I gave the Johnsons their notice," Carson said, a smug grin spreading across his face as he swirled the whiskey in his glass. 2 weeks, I told them. They'll be out by the end of the month." Bob chuckled, leaning back with his beer in hand. "Did they put up a fight?" Carson shook his head, looking pleased with himself. "Nah, they'll complain for a bit, maybe try to stall, but I've done this plenty of times. They always leave. They don't have a choice." Jerry raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You sure? What if they get the city involved or bring in one of those legal aid folks?" Carson let out a short laugh. "Please, they don't know who they're dealing with. By next month, they'll be gone, just like all the others. People like them. They don't stick around when the heat's on." He took another sip of his drink, savoring the moment. In his mind, it was already a done deal. He had seen it all before. Tenants thinking they could fight back, only to crumble under the pressure. The Johnsons were no different. Bob snorted. "You always make it look easy, Carson." "That's because it is easy," Carson replied with a smirk. "All you gotta do is apply a little pressure. They'll crack." They clinked their glasses in a toast, laughing together. Carson leaned back in the booth, satisfied. He liked the feeling of control, the knowledge that with one piece of paper, he could uproot someone's life. It gave him a sense of power that he wasn't willing to let go of. The next morning, Carson sat at his desk in his cluttered office, flipping through the stack of mail without much care. The eviction process was just one of many tasks on his list, and as far as he was concerned, it was already in motion. He had no intention of reconsidering. It was business as usual. Issue the notice, wait 2 weeks, and the tenants would be gone. No fuss, no hassle. He tore open a plain white envelope, glancing briefly at the letter inside. The words at the top of the page caught his attention. Green and Associates. He scanned the letter, quickly realizing it was from a law firm representing the Johnsons. Carson's lips twisted into a half smirk as he skimmed the contents. The letter accused him of wrongful eviction and racial discrimination, demanding he halt the process immediately. If he didn't comply, it warned, there would be legal consequences. Carson chuckled to himself and tossed the letter onto his desk. Green and Associates, he muttered. Sounds like one of those civil rights outfits, doesn't it? He leaned back in his chair, propping his feet up on the desk. To him, this was nothing more than a bluff. Lawyers like that were a dime a dozen, quick to send threats but rarely willing to follow through. It was all part of the game, and Carson knew how to play it better than anyone. Just a scare tactic, he said aloud, as if convincing himself. They won't go through with it. He leaned forward and took another look at the letter, his smirk widening. David Green, he muttered, testing the name out loud. It didn't sound familiar. Probably just some lawyer looking for easy money. Carson had dealt with plenty of them before, and they all backed off eventually. No one had the time or resources to fight a landlord in court, especially not tenants like the Johnsons. He crumpled the letter slightly in his hand before tossing it carelessly onto the growing pile of papers on his desk. Nice try, he muttered. He knew the Johnsons didn't stand a chance, Even with a lawyer on their side, they'd run out of time, money, or both. They always did. Carson leaned back, feeling satisfied. 2 weeks, he said to himself, as if reminding the universe of the timeline he had set. They'll be out of here in 2 weeks, whether they like it or not. The rest of the day passed without incident, and by the evening, the letter from Green and Associates was nothing more than a crumpled piece of paper on his desk. Carson poured himself a drink at home, settling into his recliner with the television on in the background. As far as he was concerned, the eviction was already a done deal. "They'll leave," he murmured to himself, sipping from his glass. "They always do." He stretched his legs, sinking deeper into the cushions, content. In his mind, there was no reason to worry. The Johnsons didn't have the means or the fight to stand up to him. And even if they tried, he was ready. After all, he'd been doing this for years. What was one more family? David Green's office was buzzing with quiet energy. The steady hum of phones ringing and keyboards clicking filled the space. But David was locked into his task. The lawsuit against Carson was ready. Every detail had been checked and rechecked, every violation carefully outlined. Carson had tried to evict the Johnsons under false pretenses, and David was about to make him regret it. The final document lay on his desk, crisp and clean, with the heading, "Johnson versus Carson, Wrongful Eviction and Racial Discrimination." He read it one more time, making sure there were no loose ends. Then, with a single decisive click, he filed it electronically with the court. It was official. The fight had begun. Meanwhile, in the Johnsons' apartment, Mark sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together, bouncing his knee nervously. His mind raced, weighed down by the fear of the unknown. He knew David was confident. Hell, David was always confident. But that didn't stop the doubts from creeping in. Legal battles were expensive. Court cases took time. And what if Carson found a way to win? Mrs. Johnson stood by the counter, pouring tea into 2 chipped mugs, glancing at her husband as he fidgeted. "You're going to wear a hole through the floor with all that bouncing," she said softly, trying to ease the tension with a bit of humor. Mark gave her a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This could cost us everything, Sarah," he muttered, his voice low and heavy with concern. "What if we lose? What if the judge sides with Carson? We could end up with nothing." He shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just keep thinking, are we doing the right thing?" Mrs. Johnson carried the mugs to the table and placed one in front of him. Then she sat down across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "We don't have a choice," she said firmly, her gaze steady. "This isn't just about us anymore." Mark looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Johnson sighed, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. This fight wasn't just about keeping their apartment. It was about something bigger, something she knew in her heart they couldn't walk away from. "If we back down now," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "What does that say? To Carson? To the next family he tries to push out? To our kids?" Mark stared down at his mug, his hands wrapped tightly around it. He didn't speak right away, but Mrs. Johnson knew him well enough to sense the war going on inside him. The need to protect their family, fighting against the knowledge that giving in would mean losing more than just their home. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "I know this is hard," she whispered, "but if we let him get away with this, what's stopping someone else from doing the same thing? If we don't stand up now, we're not just letting Carson win. We're letting the whole system win." Mark exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of it all. "And if we lose?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Johnson squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. Then at least we know we fought. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. And we won't be fighting alone. David's got us. We just have to trust him. Mark nodded slowly, still uncertain, but knowing deep down that she was right. This was bigger than just them. It was about sending a message to Carson, to the city, to anyone who thought they could push families like theirs out without consequence. As they sat in the quiet kitchen, the weight of their decision settled over them like a heavy blanket. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only one they could take. Later that day, David called to confirm that the lawsuit had been filed. The court's been notified, he told Mrs. Johnson over the phone. Carson's going to get the papers soon, and when he does, he's going to realize that this isn't going to go the way he thought. Mrs. Johnson smiled, a small flicker of satisfaction warming her chest. Thank you, David, she said softly. Don't thank me yet, David replied, his tone light but serious. We've still got a long way to go, but we've got the law on our side, and that's a good place to start. When Mrs. Johnson hung up, she glanced at Mark, who was sitting quietly on the couch, staring out the window. She walked over to him, sitting down beside him, and resting her head on his shoulder. We're going to be okay, she whispered. Mark reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. There were still doubts in his mind, still fears that gnawed at him. But as he sat there with his wife beside him, he knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And that was enough. Carson sat at his desk, flipping through the lawsuit papers that had just arrived, the official court seal stamped at the top. At first, he didn't pay much attention. He skimmed over the legal jargon with the same casual carelessness he applied to all tenant disputes. He had been through this process plenty of times before. Tenants always tried to push back, but they never lasted. In his mind, this was just one more step in the dance. Then he saw the name, David Green. His smirk faltered slightly as he frowned at the heading, Green and Associates, representing the Johnson family. Something about the name tickled at the back of his mind, a faint alarm that wouldn't stop buzzing. He flipped through the pages again, his movements becoming slower and more deliberate, as the reality of what he was holding began to sink in. Carson grabbed his phone and dialed the number of his lawyer, tapping his pen against the desk impatiently while it rang. Yeah, it's Carson, he said when his lawyer finally answered. We've got a little situation with the Johnsons. They filed a lawsuit. His lawyer sighed on the other end of the line. I told you, Carson. You can't evict people without a solid reason. What's in the lawsuit? Carson glanced back down at the document, annoyance prickling at his skin. They're claiming wrongful eviction and, get this, racial discrimination. Their lawyer sent me the papers today. Some guy named David Green. There was a pause on the other end. Then, his lawyer's voice dropped into a serious tone. David Green? You're sure about that? Yeah. Why? Carson asked, frowning. You've heard of him? His lawyer let out a low whistle, the kind that made Carson sit up straighter in his chair. David Green's no small-time attorney, Carson. You'd better take this seriously. He's one of the top civil rights lawyers in the state. When he files a lawsuit, it's not just about winning. It's about making a statement. He's taken down landlords, businesses, even city officials. If he's involved, this isn't just going to disappear. Carson felt the first cold stirrings of unease in his stomach. His bravado slipped just a little as he gripped the phone tighter. You're telling me this guy's the real deal? Very real, his lawyer replied grimly. And from the looks of it, he's got a solid case. If Green's involved, it means the Johnsons aren't bluffing. This isn't a scare tactic, Carson. This is serious." Carson swore under his breath and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The Johnsons were supposed to whine a little, maybe stall for time, but in the end, they were supposed to leave quietly. That's how it always worked. He had given them 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, and now they were dragging him into court. Worse, they had brought in a lawyer with a reputation. "This can't be happening," Carson muttered, almost to himself. "We were just getting rid of a problem tenant." His lawyer didn't offer any sympathy. "Well, now you've got a bigger problem. Green won't back down. He'll dig into your records, look for patterns in your tenant history, and if he finds anything suspicious, anything at all, you're done." Carson sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a heavy stone. His mouth felt dry. He could feel the control slipping away, little by little. He had always prided himself on staying one step ahead of his tenants, on being the one with the power. But now, with David Green in the picture, that power felt like it was slipping right through his fingers. "So what do we do?" Carson asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "First off, don't underestimate Green," his lawyer warned. "If there's anything in your records, any past evictions, any inconsistencies, you need to tell me now. Green's going to come at you from every angle. We need to be ready." Carson rubbed his face, frustration building alongside the creeping fear in his chest. "I didn't do anything wrong," he snapped, more to himself than to his lawyer. "I gave them notice. I followed the rules." His lawyer sighed again, a tired sound. "It doesn't matter if you think you followed the rules, Carson. What matters is how it looks. And right now, it looks like you're targeting a black family without cause. That's exactly the kind of case Green loves to sink his teeth into." Carson gritted his teeth, feeling the walls close in around him. This was supposed to be simple, an easy eviction, just like the others. Now it was spiraling out of control, and for the first time in years, he felt truly cornered. "I'll get back to you," his lawyer said. "But Carson, if you're smart, you'll start thinking about damage control. This isn't a fight you want to drag out." The line went dead, leaving Carson sitting alone at his desk, staring at the lawsuit papers spread out in front of him. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind, cold and unrelenting. He sat there for a long time, the ticking of the office clock the only sound in the room. What had seemed like a routine eviction was turning into something much worse. And for the first time in a long time, Carson wasn't sure what his next move should be. The days after the lawsuit was filed felt like a blur to the Johnsons. The tension in their home hadn't gone away, but something had shifted. There was a sense of direction now, a feeling that they weren't just waiting to be pushed out. They were fighting back. Still, doubt lingered, especially for Mark. Late at night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they had made a mistake. But each time he felt the fear creeping in, he reminded himself of Sarah's steady voice. "We have no choice. This isn't just about us anymore." What the Johnsons hadn't expected was the way the neighborhood began to respond. News of their lawsuit spread quietly at first. A whisper between tenants, a cautious murmur exchanged in the hallway. But soon, it was all anyone seemed to be talking about. The Johnsons' neighbors, many of whom had experienced similar mistreatment, began stopping by to offer support. Some came with small gestures, an extra loaf of bread, a bag of groceries, or kind words in passing. Others showed up with stories of their own. Mrs. Thompson from down the hall, an older woman with a slow shuffle and a cane, knocked on their door one morning, her hands clutching a tin of cookies. "I heard what that man tried to do to you," she said, shaking her head as Mrs. Johnson invited her inside. "I had a feeling he was up to no good, Tried to raise my rent without notice last year. Said it was just an adjustment. But I told him, "Not today, sir." I'm glad someone's finally standing up to him. As Mrs. Thompson settled into a chair at the kitchen table, Mrs. Johnson stood there, listening, something stirring in her chest, a feeling she hadn't expected. She had spent so much time thinking they were on their own, bracing herself for isolation. But now, people were showing up. They weren't alone after all. Later that same day, a group of neighbors stopped by. 2 families from the first floor and a young couple from the building next door. They brought homemade soup, a few bags of groceries, and most importantly, words of encouragement. They shared their experiences with landlords who had tried to cheat them, raise their rent unfairly, or pressure them into leaving. "You're doing the right thing," said Mrs. Campos, a tenant from the first floor. "This fight isn't just for you. It's for all of us." Standing in the doorway, Mrs. Johnson felt her heart swell. She had never imagined the neighborhood would come together like this. She exchanged glances with Mark, who stood quietly beside her, watching their neighbors offer support without hesitation. After the neighbors left, Mrs. Johnson leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely over her chest. "I never thought people would come together like this for us," she said softly, almost to herself. Mark stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "It's good to know we're not alone," he said, his voice carrying a trace of relief. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have a fight on our hands." Mrs. Johnson gave him a small smile. He was right, of course. The gestures from their neighbors were a reminder that they weren't alone, but they still had to win this battle. There was a long way to go, and Carson wasn't going to back down easily. But knowing the community stood with them, that made a difference. It gave them strength they hadn't known they needed. The following days brought more quiet acts of solidarity. A neighbor stopped by with a spare box of diapers. Another tenant offered to help keep an eye on Daniel so the Johnsons could focus on the legal fight. Someone even slipped an anonymous note under their door that read, "We're with you. Don't give up." Each small gesture chipped away at the fear that had taken root in their hearts, replacing it with something more powerful: hope. One evening, as they sat together at the dining table, Tia looked up from her homework. "Do you think Carson knows everyone's talking about him?" she asked, her voice curious but edged with a hint of satisfaction. Mark chuckled, a rare sound these days, but a welcome one. "I hope so," he said. "He needs to know people aren't just going to roll over for him." Mrs. Johnson leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "This isn't just about Carson anymore," she said quietly. "It's about all the families who've been through this, and the ones who'll come after us if we don't stop him." Mark gave a slow nod, the weight of her words settling between them. "We're doing this," he said, as if reminding himself. "We're really doing this." Mrs. Johnson smiled, a soft but determined expression on her face. "Yes," she said, "we are." They sat there for a moment, soaking in the quiet strength of their shared resolve. They knew the fight wasn't over. There would be court dates, meetings with David, and difficult days ahead. But with their neighbors behind them, with their community standing in solidarity, they didn't feel as small as they once had. The weight of the battle ahead hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter now, shared across the shoulders of many. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for something bigger. And they were ready. It started early one morning, just as the Johnsons were beginning to feel the weight of their fight lift, buoyed by the support of their neighbors. The first sign of trouble came with a flicker. The lights in the apartment dimmed, then went completely dark. Tia, sitting at the dining table finishing her homework, let out a confused noise. "Mom?" The lights just went out. Mrs. Johnson looked up from the kitchen, a frown creasing her forehead. "That's strange." She tried the switch by the stove, but nothing happened. Mark came in from the living room, wiping his hands on his pants. "What's going on?" Before Mrs. Johnson could answer, Tia called from the sink. "There's no water either." Mrs. Johnson's chest tightened. She walked to the faucet, turning the knob, but not even a trickle came out. Her eyes met Mark's, and in that silent exchange, they both knew. This wasn't just a coincidence. Mark stormed over to the front door and grabbed his jacket, anger bubbling just under the surface. "That bastard," he muttered, slamming the door shut behind him as he headed downstairs to check with the neighbors. A few minutes later, he was back, breathing hard with frustration. "It's just us," he said bitterly, slamming the door behind him. "Everyone else has power and water." Tia folded her arms, her voice full of disbelief. "So Carson just shut us off? Can he do that?" Mark ran a hand over his head, pacing the room like a lion in a cage. "He's trying to make our lives unbearable," he growled, his voice sharp with frustration. "This is war." Daniel, sitting on the floor with his toy cars, looked up with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, what's war?" Mark sighed heavily, crouching down next to his son. "It's when someone tries to push you around and you fight back," he explained gently. Then he looked up at Mrs. Johnson, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "And we are going to fight back." Mrs. Johnson remained calm, though inside she could feel the anger building, a quiet storm held tightly in check. She walked over to the kitchen table and picked up her phone. Carson was desperate. She could see it clearly now. He thought that if he made their lives miserable enough, they'd give up and leave. But he didn't know them. Not really. And he definitely didn't know David. "Let him try," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice steady. "We've got David on our side, and we're not backing down." Mark scoffed, throwing his hands up in frustration. "What's next? He's going to cut off the heat too? What are we supposed to do if this drags out, Sarah?" Mrs. Johnson walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "We do what we've always done," she said softly. "We get through it, one day at a time." Mark let out a long breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, though the frustration was still there. "We shouldn't have to live like this," he muttered. "No, we shouldn't," Mrs. Johnson agreed, "and that's why we fight." She picked up her phone and dialed David's number. He answered after just 2 rings, his voice alert and calm. "Sarah, what's going on?" Mrs. Johnson kept her voice steady, though the anger simmered beneath the surface. "Carson cut off our utilities. We've got no water, no lights. He's trying to force us out." There was a brief pause on David's end, followed by a low, measured tone. "That's illegal. He just gave us more ammunition." Mrs. Johnson smiled, a small flicker of satisfaction warming her chest. "I thought you might say that." "Don't worry," David continued. "I'll handle it. This won't stand." After she hung up, Mrs. Johnson turned to Mark, her expression calm but determined. "David's on it. Carson just made a big mistake." Mark nodded, though the frustration still lingered. "Good. I'm ready to be done with this." Mrs. Johnson gave him a reassuring smile. "We'll get through it," she said. "And when we do, Carson will wish he'd never started this." For the rest of the day, the Johnsons made do with what they had. They opened the windows for light, boiled bottled water on a small camp stove that Mark had dug out from the closet, and bundled up in extra layers to prepare for the night. It wasn't easy, but they had each other, and that made all the difference. That evening, as they sat together in the dim living room, Tia looked around at her family, a determined glint in her eyes. "We're not giving up, are we?" Mrs. Johnson smiled, pulling her daughter close. "No, baby," she said softly. "We're not going anywhere." Mark leaned back in his chair, a small, tired smile forming on his face. "Let him try," he said quietly, echoing his wife's earlier words. "We're not backing down." And with those words, the Johnsons settled in for the night, their resolve stronger than ever. Carson thought he could break them, but he was wrong. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. And they weren't alone. The next morning, Mrs. Johnson sat at the dining table, her phone pressed to her ear, waiting for David to answer. Mark was across from her, drinking his coffee in silence, his frustration still simmering from the night before. The apartment was cold, the early morning light casting long shadows across the walls. They had slept bundled in extra blankets, determined not to let Carson's tactics break them. When David's calm voice finally came through the phone, it was like a lifeline. "Sarah, I've been expecting your call. Tell me what happened." Mrs. Johnson kept her voice steady, though the weight of it all was beginning to wear her down. "Carson cut off our utilities," she said. "No water, no lights. He's trying to force us out." There was a brief pause on David's end, and when he spoke again, his tone was calm and deliberate. "He just gave us exactly what we needed. This is harassment, plain and simple. He's making things worse for himself." Mrs. Johnson glanced at Mark, who raised an eyebrow. "You think we can use this?" she asked, hopeful but cautious. "Absolutely," David replied without hesitation. "This is a gift. The utility shutoffs are illegal. We'll file additional complaints today and strengthen the case. Every step Carson takes just shows the court how desperate he is. His actions are building our argument for us." Mark shook his head, disbelief in his eyes. "So, cutting off our power was a good thing?" David chuckled lightly. "In a way, yes. He's doing all the work for us, Mark. It proves that he's not following the law. He's trying to bully you out of your home. And judges don't look kindly on landlords who take matters into their own hands." Mrs. Johnson exhaled slowly, the tension easing from her shoulders for the first time since the lights went out. David's calm, measured tone had a way of making the impossible feel manageable. She could see it now. Every reckless move Carson made only tightened the noose around his own neck. Mark leaned forward, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm himself. "So, what's the next step?" "I'm filing a motion to the court today," David answered. "We'll document the utility shutoff as harassment and request immediate relief. I'll also contact the City Housing Authority. Carson's going to have a lot more people looking at his business by the time I'm done." Mrs. Johnson nodded, a flicker of hope reigniting in her chest. "And what about the utilities? How long will it take to get them back on?" "I'll push for a quick response," David assured her. "Once the city gets involved, Carson will be forced to restore everything, or he'll face fines, and possibly criminal charges. Trust me, this is going to backfire on him." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "It feels like we're living in a war zone," he muttered. "We're just trying to survive each day." David's voice softened, but his determination didn't waver. "I know it's tough, but you're not just surviving, you're fighting. And from where I stand, you're winning. Every desperate move Carson makes just proves he knows he's losing." Mrs. Johnson gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, David. I don't know what we'd do without you." "You don't have to thank me, Sarah," David replied warmly. "We're in this together. Just hang tight and let me handle Carson." After the call ended, Mrs. Johnson set the phone down and looked at Mark. "David's got it under control," she said quietly. "This is just another step. Carson's only digging himself in deeper." Mark gave a reluctant nod, his jaw still tight with lingering frustration. It just doesn't sit right, you know? I hate that he's putting us through this." Mrs. Johnson reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I know," she whispered, "but we're going to get through it. Carson can't win if we don't give up." Mark squeezed her hand, some of the tension leaving his body. "I just want it to be over," he admitted softly. "It will be," Mrs. Johnson promised. "Soon." By that afternoon, things were already in motion. David's legal team filed an urgent complaint with the court, documenting the utility shutoffs as part of an escalating pattern of harassment. The additional complaint strengthened the original lawsuit, painting a clear picture of Carson's illegal behavior. David also reached out to the City Housing Authority, ensuring that the right people were made aware of Carson's actions. Within hours, the situation began to shift in their favor. Late that evening, the Johnsons heard a knock at the door. Mark opened it to find 2 city inspectors standing on the front step. One of them held a clipboard, flipping through pages as he introduced himself. "We're with the Housing Authority. We received a complaint about your utilities being shut off. We're here to investigate." Mark stepped aside, letting them in. The inspectors moved efficiently, checking the taps, flipping light switches, and making notes. They didn't seem surprised by what they found. It wasn't the first time they'd seen a landlord try to use utility shutoffs as a weapon. "Everything checks out," one of the inspectors said after a quick review. "This is a clear violation. We'll be issuing an order to have your water and electricity restored immediately." Mark let out a long breath, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said quietly. The inspector gave a small nod, glancing around the apartment. "We've seen this before," he said. "You did the right thing by getting a lawyer involved. People like Carson need to be held accountable." After the inspectors left, Mark and Mrs. Johnson sat together on the couch, the weight of the day slowly lifting from their shoulders. The apartment was still cold and dark, but there was a lightness in the air now, a sense that things were beginning to turn in their favor. Tia came out from her room, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Are they going to fix everything?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Mrs. Johnson smiled, pulling her daughter close. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "They'll turn the lights and water back on soon. We're going to be okay." Mark leaned back, exhaling deeply. "David was right," he said, his voice calmer now. "Carson's only making this worse for himself." Mrs. Johnson nodded, resting her head on Mark's shoulder. "And we're not backing down," she whispered. As they sat together in the quiet of their home, the Johnsons knew that the tide was finally beginning to turn. Carson's desperation had only made them stronger. And with David's calm strategy guiding them, they were ready for whatever came next. Carson sat slumped behind his desk, the bright morning light streaming through the blinds doing little to chase away the storm cloud building in his mind. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled through his phone, staring at headline after headline that carried his name. One article read, "Local landlord faces racial discrimination lawsuit." Another, "David Green takes on Carson in eviction battle, a case that could set precedent." His jaw clenched as he slammed the phone down on the desk, the screen going dark beneath his palm. This wasn't supposed to be a big deal. It was just an eviction, a routine notice to push out tenants he didn't want anymore. People moved out all the time. The Johnsons weren't special. How had this gotten so out of control? The phone buzzed again, and Carson snatched it up, his pulse quickening. Another news alert, this one from a local TV station preparing to air an investigative piece. "Damn it," he hissed under his breath, tossing the phone onto the cluttered desk. His email inbox wasn't any better. Messages from tenants asking if the stories were true, reporters requesting statements, and a few unsettling emails from advocacy groups demanding accountability. The noise was growing, and Carson was starting to feel trapped. Panic gnawed at the edges of his mind. It had all escalated so fast. He thought it would be simple. Give the Johnsons their notice, push them out quietly, and move on. But now the lawsuit had blown the whole thing wide open, and David Green was dragging his name through the mud. The media had latched onto the case like vultures circling a wounded animal, and Carson could feel them closing in. The control he once had was slipping through his fingers. He picked up the phone again and dialed his lawyer's number, gripping the receiver so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The phone rang twice before his lawyer picked up, his voice cool and professional as always. "Carson, I was expecting your call." Carson could barely contain the frustration boiling inside him. "This wasn't supposed to be a big deal," he exploded, pacing back and forth across his office. "It's just an eviction. Now my name is all over the news and people are calling me a racist landlord. What the hell am I supposed to do?" His lawyer remained calm, though there was a note of impatience in his voice. "I warned you this might happen. The minute David Green took the case, you should have known it wasn't going to stay quiet." Carson's breath hissed through his teeth as he ran a hand through his thinning hair, pulling at it slightly. He hated feeling out of control. "I thought it was just a bluff. Tenants don't usually fight back like this. How did it turn into such a mess?" His lawyer sighed. "Green doesn't bluff. You're dealing with someone who's made a career out of fighting cases just like this. And now the media's involved, which means it's only going to get worse if you don't act fast." Carson stopped pacing and leaned heavily on his desk, his fingers digging into the edge. "What do I do?" he demanded, his voice laced with desperation. "How do I make this stop?" His lawyer's voice was firm, offering the only path forward. "Settle. Drop the eviction, pay damages, and make this go away before it gets worse." Carson's stomach churned at the thought. He hated the idea of backing down, hated the idea of giving in to people like the Johnsons. It wasn't just about money. It was about pride. Settling would mean admitting defeat. It would mean the Johnsons had won, and that thought was unbearable. "I can't just roll over," Carson muttered, half to himself. "If I settle, it'll look like I was in the wrong." His lawyer's voice sharpened. "Carson, you are in the wrong, and the longer you drag this out, the worse it's going to look. Every day that the utilities stay off, every interview Green gives, every headline with your name in it, it all adds up. The court will see it. The public will see it. You're running out of time to control this." Carson sank into his chair, pressing his hand against his forehead. The walls were closing in, and he could feel the panic rising in his chest like a tide he couldn't hold back. How had everything spiraled out of control so quickly? "I just wanted them out," he whispered, almost to himself. "I didn't think it would turn into this." His lawyer's voice softened slightly, but there was no sympathy in it. "It's already out of your hands. If you settle now, you can walk away with minimal damage. But if you keep fighting, Carson, it'll ruin you." Carson sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a stone on his chest. Settle. Drop the eviction. Pay the Johnsons. It was the logical move, but it felt like a bitter defeat, one that would leave a sour taste in his mouth for the rest of his life. "I need time to think," Carson muttered, though he knew time was the one thing he didn't have. "Think fast," his lawyer warned. "The longer you wait, the more leverage Green gains. And once the court sees the full picture, your eviction tactics, the utility shutoffs, the media attention, you won't just lose the case. You'll lose everything." Carson ended the call and stared at the papers strewn across his desk, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. The air in the office felt heavy, suffocating. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, trapped by a situation of his own making. The game he thought he controlled was slipping away, and no amount of bluffing would save him now. He picked up the letter from David Green's firm, his hands trembling slightly as he read the bold, unwavering words. "We are prepared to pursue this matter to the fullest extent of the law." Carson closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise in his head. The headlines, the emails, the phone calls, the warnings from his lawyer. But no matter how hard he tried, the truth was impossible to ignore. The Johnsons weren't backing down, and David Green was coming for him. Carson sat at his desk, staring at the phone for a long time before finally picking it up. The silence in his office felt heavier than usual, suffocating, as if the walls were pressing in on him. His lawyer's words still echoed in his mind. "Settle now, or it'll ruin you." Carson hated the idea. Settling felt like losing. But with the media circling and David Green breathing down his neck, he didn't see another way out. His hand hovered over the keypad for a moment, his jaw tight. He'd never been one to back down, but this situation had spiraled too far beyond his control. The lawsuit wasn't going away. Every day, new headlines appeared, dragging his name further into the mud. The court date was fast approaching, and Green showed no signs of letting up. Carson clenched his teeth as he dialed the number for Green and Associates. The phone rang twice before a smooth, professional voice answered. "David Green speaking." For a brief moment, Carson hesitated, caught off guard by Green's calm tone. He had expected arrogance or anger, something he could latch onto and argue with. But David's voice was steady, like a man who knew he was in complete control. Yes, Mr. Green, it's Carson, Thomas Carson. I wanted to talk about the lawsuit." David didn't respond immediately, and in the silence that followed, Carson felt his stomach twist with unease. When David finally spoke, his voice was cool, measured. "Go on." Carson cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Look, I've been thinking," he began, forcing a casual tone he didn't feel. "Maybe we can make this whole thing go away. I'm willing to drop the eviction and, work something out. Settle this privately." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Carson could almost hear David considering his words, weighing them like a judge considering a verdict. The silence felt like a noose tightening around Carson's neck. When David spoke again, his voice was colder than before, sharp as a knife. "It's too late for that, Mr. Carson." Carson's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" "I'm offering to drop the eviction. Isn't that what you wanted?" David's response was swift and final, his words cutting through the air like the crack of a gavel. "This isn't about just dropping the case, Mr. Carson. This is about justice. For the Johnsons, and for every other family you've tried to push around." Carson felt the blood drain from his face. He had underestimated Green. He thought he could negotiate his way out, offer a settlement, and make the whole thing disappear. But David Green wasn't playing that game. This wasn't just a legal battle to him. It was personal. "This is going to court," David continued, his tone unyielding. "And when it does, everyone will know exactly what kind of man you are." Carson's heart pounded in his chest, panic creeping into his voice. "There's no need for all that," he said quickly. "We can work this out. No need to drag it through court." David's voice remained steady, unmoved. "I think there is. People like you have gotten away with this for too long. It stops here." Carson swallowed hard, the weight of David's words pressing down on him. He had run out of options. The confidence he once carried, the belief that he could control this situation, was gone. Green wasn't going to settle. The fight was coming, whether Carson liked it or not. "Good luck, Mr. Carson," David said, his voice calm but final. "You're going to need it." The line went dead, leaving Carson sitting in stunned silence, the phone still clutched in his hand. For a long moment, he just sat there, unable to move, his mind racing with the realization that he had lost control completely. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if the answer to his problems might be written there. But there was no way out. Not this time. The pretrial hearings arrived faster than Carson expected, but not fast enough for Mrs. Johnson, who felt every passing day weigh heavier on her heart. Each morning felt like a battle. The apartment was filled with tension, a quiet, invisible pressure squeezing at her chest. Even with David Green's steady hand guiding them through the legal process, the fight was wearing her down. It was in the little things. Her hands trembling as she made breakfast, the way her shoulders sagged when the phone rang, and in the exhaustion that lived behind her eyes. Carson's lawyers had wasted no time filing motion after motion, hoping to delay the trial, but David had blocked them at every turn. "It's standard practice," David had explained during one of his late-night calls with the Johnsons. "They think if they drag this out long enough, you'll give up, but we're not giving them that chance." True to his word, David shot down every attempt to stall. Carson's legal team filed for continuances, procedural delays, and requests for extensions, but David responded to each motion with precision and speed. He kept the case on track, forcing Carson's team to stay on their heels. The trial date loomed ever closer, and the mounting pressure showed in every corner of Carson's life. But for the Johnsons, it didn't feel fast enough. Each small victory in court seemed to take forever, and every day felt like another step through mud. Late one night, Mrs. Johnson sat at the kitchen table, her head resting on her folded arms. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall were the only sounds in the room. The silence felt thick, pressing down on her like a blanket she couldn't shake off. How much longer could they live like this? Waiting, hoping, wondering if justice would ever come. Mark walked into the room quietly, sitting down across from her. "Hey," he said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. Her fingers were cold and limp, and when she lifted her head to look at him, her eyes were filled with exhaustion. "How much longer do we have to endure this?" she whispered, her voice brittle, like it might crack if she spoke too loud. She wasn't asking for a precise answer, just some sign that the end was in sight. Mark gave her hand a gentle squeeze, trying to offer the comfort she needed, even though he was just as tired. "We're getting closer," he said, his voice quiet but reassuring. "It's almost over." Mrs. Johnson closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that had threatened to fall too many times these past few weeks. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this nightmare would end soon, that Carson's grip on their lives would finally be broken. But the waiting, the endless waiting, was eating away at her. Mark leaned in closer, brushing his thumb over the back of her hand. "We've come too far to stop now," he murmured. "David's got everything under control. Carson's out of moves. All we have to do is hold on a little longer." Mrs. Johnson gave a small, tired nod, though the strain in her heart didn't ease. How much longer could they keep holding on? The court battles, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty. It was all piling up, threatening to crush them. Mark shifted his chair closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We're almost there," he whispered. "I know it's hard, but we're almost there." For a moment, Mrs. Johnson leaned into him, letting herself rest against his warmth. Mark had always been her steady place, even when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. They were in this together. and somehow, that made the weight feel a little lighter. Meanwhile, across town, Carson sat slumped in the leather chair of his lawyer's office, rubbing his temples as his legal team tried to explain the latest developments. None of the delay tactics had worked. Every motion had been blocked, and the trial was now set in stone. "Green's playing hardball," one of the lawyers said, flipping through a stack of papers. "We've exhausted all our options for stalling. There's no way around it. We're going to trial." Carson let out a frustrated sigh, clenching his fists. The cracks in his once confident demeanor were starting to show. He had hoped to drag the case out, wear the Johnsons down, and force them to settle quietly. But that plan had failed. David Green wasn't just any lawyer. He was relentless. "This wasn't supposed to be a big deal," Carson muttered, slamming his hand on the armrest. "It's just an eviction. Why won't they just drop it?" His lawyer glanced at him, unimpressed. "Because Green isn't just fighting for the Johnsons," he said coolly. "He's fighting to make an example out of you. And if we lose this, Carson, it won't just be about money. Your reputation is on the line." Carson gritted his teeth, feeling the walls close in. He had no more moves left to play. The trial date was set, and the Johnsons weren't backing down. His only option now was to fight and hope he could survive the fallout. The courtroom was packed with people by the time the trial began, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Reporters lined the back row, their pens poised over notebooks, waiting to capture every word. A quiet hum of whispers rippled through the crowd as people settled into their seats, accompanied by the rustling of papers and the occasional cough. This wasn't just an eviction case anymore. It had become a public showdown, with more at stake than just the Johnsons' home. Mrs. Johnson sat at the plaintiff's table beside David Green, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mark sat next to her, his posture stiff but steady, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze now and then. Across the courtroom, Carson sat with his legal team, shifting nervously in his chair. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, and he avoided making eye contact with the crowd watching him closely. The tension in the room felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. When the judge entered, the gavel cracked once, silencing the murmurs. Everyone stood, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filling the room. "You may be seated," the judge said, his voice firm. The trial was officially underway. Carson's lawyer rose first, straightening his tie and stepping forward to deliver the opening statement. His tone was polished and professional, the kind of voice meant to sound reasonable. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began. "This case is, at its core, about a property dispute. Mr. Carson acted within his legal rights when he issued an eviction notice to the Johnsons. The eviction was not motivated by malice or prejudice, but simply by business decisions. We will demonstrate that Mr. Carson followed the law, and that this lawsuit is an overreaction by tenants unwilling to comply with the rules." He paced in front of the jury box, hands clasped behind his back, his words carefully measured. "What we have here," he continued, "is a misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion. This is about property management, not discrimination." With that, he returned to his seat, casting a brief glance at Carson, who gave him a small nod, though his jaw remained clenched. David Green rose next. The energy in the room seemed to shift the moment he stood, a calm intensity settling over the space. David buttoned his jacket, his expression steady and composed as he walked toward the center of the courtroom. He faced the jury, his gaze sweeping across them, holding their attention with ease. His voice was smooth, clear, and deliberate. "Your Honor, members of the jury," David began, "this case is not just about a landlord and his tenants. It's about power and prejudice, and we will prove that Mr. Carson acted unlawfully." His words carried weight, each sentence landing like a stone dropped into still water. He let the silence linger for a moment before continuing, giving everyone time to absorb what he had just said. "This case," David said, "is not just about rent payments or property rules. It's about a pattern of discrimination, subtle but deliberate. Mr. Carson did not issue an eviction notice because the Johnsons failed to meet their obligations. He did it because he didn't want them here, not because they were bad tenants, but because they are a black family." A murmur rippled through the audience, but David remained composed, as if he had expected it. He took a step closer to the jury, locking eyes with several of them. "We will show you that Mr. Carson's actions were not motivated by professionalism, but by prejudice. We will present evidence of harassment, utility shutoffs, illegal actions designed to make life unbearable for the Johnsons. And we will demonstrate that when the Johnsons stood up for their rights, Mr. Carson tried to use his power to silence them." Mrs. Johnson sat up straighter in her chair, feeling David's words resonate deep within her. He was telling their story, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, she felt truly heard. Mark gave her hand another squeeze, his gaze never leaving David as he spoke. "This case," David continued, his voice steady but firm, "is about more than just the Johnsons. It's about ensuring that no family has to go through what they have endured. It's about sending a message that no one, no matter how much power they think they have, is above the law." David took a step back toward the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "By the end of this trial," he said, "we will ask you to deliver justice, not just for the Johnsons, but for every family that deserves to live with dignity and fairness in the place they call home." With that, David returned to his seat. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Mark leaned toward Mrs. Johnson and whispered, "He's good." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet hope she hadn't felt in weeks. Across the room, Carson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face pale. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something to him, but Carson barely acknowledged it. He could feel the tide turning, and for the first time, he realized just how serious the situation had become. The trial had only just begun, but Carson knew deep down that this was not going to end the way he had hoped. The courtroom was still and tense as the testimonies began. Each new witness chipped away at Carson's carefully built facade, revealing the ugly truth he had tried to hide. One by one, tenants and former tenants took the stand, recounting their own experiences living under Carson's management. They told stories of rent increases without warning, ignored maintenance requests, and subtle but unmistakable patterns of eviction notices targeting tenants of color. An older man named Mr. Daniels, who had lived in the building years before, leaned toward the microphone, his voice rough but steady. "It was always the same thing," he said. "Whenever new tenants moved in, if they weren't the right kind, Carson found a way to get rid of them. First, the complaints would start, things like noise or parking, just little stuff. Then, the notices came, and if that didn't work, he'd cut off your heat or water. The message was clear. If you were black or brown, you weren't welcome." David Green nodded thoughtfully as Mr. Daniels finished, allowing the testimony to hang in the air before saying, "Thank you, Mr. Daniels." He glanced at the jury, watching their faces shift, expressions turning from neutral to uneasy as the pattern became impossible to ignore. More witnesses followed, each story echoing the same theme. A single mother named Carla described how Carson raised her rent twice in 6 months without explanation, only to issue her an eviction notice when she couldn't keep up. "It felt like he was waiting for me to fail," she said, her voice tinged with quiet bitterness. like he wanted me gone from the start. Each testimony added weight to the case, like bricks stacking higher and higher until Carson could no longer hide behind his lawyer's polished arguments. With each witness, he sank deeper into his chair, his face tight with frustration as if willing the words away. Then, it was Mrs. Johnson's turn. The room seemed to hold its breath as she rose from her seat at the plaintiff's table and made her way to the stand. Mark gave her hand a squeeze before she left, whispering, "You've got this." Mrs. Johnson sat down, adjusting the microphone slightly with trembling fingers. She wasn't used to public speaking, let alone testifying in a courtroom, with all eyes on her. But this wasn't just about her or even her family. It was about standing up to Carson, about making sure no one else would have to go through what they had. David Green approached the stand, giving her a small, reassuring nod. "Mrs. Johnson, can you tell the court how Mr. Carson's actions affected your family?" Mrs. Johnson swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat for a moment. But then she looked at Mark, sitting at the table, and thought of Tia and Daniel, the little moments stolen from them by stress and fear. She straightened her back and began to speak, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "Mr. Carson made us feel like outsiders in our own home," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "He treated us like we didn't belong, not because of anything we did, but because of the color of our skin." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. She needed the jury to hear this, to understand what they had gone through. At first, it was little things. Maintenance requests went unanswered. Then, he gave us that eviction notice, even though we paid our rent on time. And when that didn't scare us off, he shut off our power and water, hoping we'd give up and leave. David stood calmly at her side, giving her space to tell her story, the quiet strength of his presence steadying her. "We were scared," Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice thick with emotion now. "Not just for ourselves, but for our children. No one should have to explain to their kids that they're being forced out of their home because of the way they look." She paused, her breath shaky, but she wasn't finished. Her fear had turned into something stronger. Resolve. "But we decided not to run. We decided to fight, because we knew if we gave up, Carson would just do the same thing to another family." David gave her a reassuring nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." As she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of her words still hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. She walked back to her seat beside Mark, who gave her hand another squeeze. "You did good," he whispered. She smiled softly, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. On the other side of the courtroom, Carson sat stiffly, his face pale and drawn. The testimonies had hit harder than he'd expected, peeling back the mask he'd tried to hide behind. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but Carson barely registered it. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. The judge called for a brief recess, and as the jury filed out, David Green turned toward the Johnsons, giving them a small but confident smile. They had done what they came here to do, tell their story. Now, all they could do was wait, and trust that justice would follow. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Thomas Carson was called to the stand. All eyes followed him as he stood, straightening his jacket with shaky hands. Gone was the smug confidence he had displayed at the start of this ordeal. Now, his movements were stiff and mechanical, as if weighed down by the pressure of everything collapsing around him. He shuffled to the witness stand, avoiding eye contact with the jury, the judge, and especially the Johnsons. When he sat down, the wooden chair creaked beneath his weight, and he wiped his palms on his trousers before gripping the arms of the seat. His lawyer gave him a slight nod from the defense table, silently urging him to keep his composure. Carson nodded back, but there was no hiding the tension in his face. The walls had closed in, and the weight of his own actions threatened to crush him. He adjusted the microphone in front of him, cleared his throat, and prepared himself to answer what he hoped would be predictable questions. The first few questions from his own attorney went as expected. His lawyer guided him through his rehearsed responses, painting Carson as a businessman just doing his job, as someone who only issued the eviction notice out of professional necessity. Carson clung to that narrative, repeating phrases about following policies and managing the property efficiently. But it was clear from his faltering tone that he wasn't convincing anyone. The cracks in his story were starting to show. Then it was David Green's turn. The courtroom grew unnervingly quiet as David stood, straightened his jacket, and slowly approached the stand with the calm precision of a man in control. He carried no notes in his hand. He didn't need any. His questions were sharp weapons, ready to cut through Carson's carefully crafted defenses. David stopped in front of the stand, locking eyes with Carson, who immediately looked away, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Carson," David began, his voice steady and deliberate, "please tell the court, why did you feel it necessary to evict a family that always paid their rent on time?" The question landed like a hammer. Carson opened his mouth, hesitated, then shut it again, fumbling for an answer that wouldn't sound as bad as the truth. His lawyer shifted in his seat, his expression tight with unease, already sensing the unraveling. "Well?" Carson stammered, licking his lips nervously. "There were complaints. Other tenants complained. I had to do what was best for the building." David nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Carson's answer for a moment. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he asked, "And these complaints, do you have any written records of them? Emails, reports, anything like that?" Carson squirmed under David's gaze. "No, not exactly," he muttered. "They were verbal, just things people said to me in passing." David's expression didn't change, but there was an unmistakable glint in his eye, a hunter who had cornered his prey. The jury shifted in their seats, sensing the trap Carson was walking into. "So," David continued, his voice smooth as silk, "you decided to evict the Johnson family, who had never missed a rent payment, based on complaints you can't prove ever existed?" Carson's jaw clenched, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "It wasn't just the complaints," he snapped defensively. "They were late once, over a year ago." David raised an eyebrow, as if the excuse was beneath even addressing. "A single late payment from over a year ago?" he repeated, letting the absurdity of it hang in the air. The jury exchanged glances, unimpressed. Carson's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, as if silently begging his client to stop talking. But Carson was unraveling, and there was no stopping him now. David stepped closer, his voice still calm but unyielding. "Tell the court, Mr. Carson, how many other tenants in your building have been late on their rent once?" Carson hesitated, his face pale. I don't know," he muttered. "Do you keep records of their late payments?" David asked, his tone razor sharp. Carson glanced at his lawyer, who looked down, defeated. "Yes, no, not every time." David gave the smallest nod, as if he had expected that answer. He wasn't asking questions to gather information. He already knew the truth. He was leading Carson to destroy his own defense. "And yet," David said softly, "you singled out the Johnson family, a family that paid their rent, followed the rules, and asked for nothing more than to live peacefully in their home." His voice grew just a fraction harder. "Why, Mr. Carson? Why them?" Carson's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his hands gripping the armrests as if they were the only thing keeping him upright. He was trapped. He knew it. The jury knew it. Everyone in the room could see the truth written on his face. "They were," Carson began, but the words died in his throat. He couldn't say it. Not out loud. Not in front of the judge, the jury, and the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. David waited for a moment, letting Carson's silence speak louder than any answer could. Then, with quiet finality, he asked the last question. "Would you have treated them differently if they weren't a black family?" The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Carson's face flushed with anger and shame. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked toward his lawyer, desperate for an escape, but there was none. His lawyer sat stone-faced, knowing the damage was done. Carson finally muttered, "That's not what this was about." But the words sounded hollow, even to him. The courtroom knew the truth now. There was no recovering from it. David turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." He walked back to his seat, leaving Carson sitting on the stand, pale and deflated, his arrogance shattered under the weight of his own lies. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the testimony, but Carson barely registered it. He had lost, and everyone in the room knew it. The courtroom was still, the weight of anticipation thick in the air as everyone waited for the jury to return. It felt like time had slowed to a crawl. Mrs. Johnson sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest, and every shallow breath felt like it wasn't enough. Mark sat beside her, his hand resting over hers, squeezing gently, offering what little comfort he could. On the other side of the room, Carson sat stiffly, his face pale, beads of sweat visible on his brow. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Carson didn't respond. He was trapped in his own thoughts, knowing there was nothing more he could do. The door to the jury room creaked open, and 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom, their faces solemn. Mrs. Johnson straightened in her seat, holding her breath. This was the moment they had fought so hard for, the moment they had waited for through sleepless nights, cold days without utilities, and months of doubt. Mark squeezed her hand again, but she barely felt it, her focus locked on the jury as they took their seats. The judge's gavel cracked sharply against the wood, silencing the quiet murmurs that rippled through the room. "The court will now hear the verdict," the judge announced. He nodded toward the jury foreman, an older woman seated in the front row, holding a folded piece of paper. She stood slowly, unfolding the paper with careful hands. Mrs. Johnson clenched her hands even tighter, her stomach twisting in knots. The foreman cleared her throat, and in a steady voice, she read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mr. Thomas Carson, guilty of wrongful eviction and racial discrimination." The words hit Mrs. Johnson like a wave crashing over her, filling her with relief so intense it nearly brought her to tears. She let out a shaky breath, her body sagging as if the weight she'd carried for so long had finally been lifted. Mark leaned in close, his voice a soft whisper in her ear. "We did it, Sarah. We fought back. And we won." Mrs. Johnson turned toward him, her eyes welling with tears, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. She could barely believe it. After everything they had endured, the threats, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, it was over. And they had won. The judge gave a final, formal nod. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiffs, the Johnson family. Mr. Carson is ordered to pay damages for wrongful eviction and discrimination. The utilities will be restored immediately, and the eviction notice is null and void." Mrs. Johnson covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. The battle they had fought was over, and they had stood their ground. The fight hadn't been in vain. They hadn't just won their home. They had won justice. Mark wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. She leaned into him, letting out a deep, shaky breath, knowing that the worst was finally behind them. Tia, seated behind them in the gallery, grinned from ear to ear, her eyes bright with pride. "I knew we could do it," she whispered excitedly, her small voice filled with triumph. On the other side of the room, Carson sat frozen, his face ashen, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His lawyer leaned in, speaking quietly, but Carson didn't respond. He knew the truth now. He had lost. The power he once wielded so easily over others was gone, shattered by the Johnson family's resolve and David Green's unrelenting pursuit of justice. David Green stood calmly beside the Johnsons, his expression steady, but there was the slightest trace of satisfaction in his eyes. He had done what he set out to do. He had made sure Carson was held accountable, not just for the Johnsons, but for every family he had wronged. He leaned down toward Mrs. Johnson, offering her a small, warm smile. "It's over," he said quietly. "You did it." Mrs. Johnson smiled back, her heart full. "No," she whispered. "We all did." The judge gave a final tap of the gavel. "This court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed toward David Green, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, eager to capture his words. But David stayed focused on the Johnsons, walking with them toward the exit. This wasn't about the media or public recognition. It was about a family reclaiming their dignity. When they stepped outside, the bright sunlight washed over them, chasing away the shadows of the past few months. Mark pulled Mrs. Johnson close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It's over," he whispered again. "It's finally over." Mrs. Johnson closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun settle deep into her bones. For the first time in months, she felt free. The scene outside the courthouse was electric. Cameras flashed, reporters crowded the steps, and microphones jostled for position. The verdict had spread fast, and the press was hungry for every detail. Carson had slunk out the back, his face pale and tight with humiliation, trying to avoid the growing crowd of reporters waiting to capture the face of defeat. His carefully guarded reputation had been shattered, replaced by headlines labeling him a discriminatory landlord. The damages the court ordered him to pay were significant, enough to make an impact on his business. But it was the public shame that hit him hardest. His name had become synonymous with prejudice, and no amount of legal maneuvering could restore what he had lost. Standing on the courthouse steps, David Green was surrounded by reporters, their voices overlapping as they called out questions. He stood tall, calm, and composed, with the Johnson family by his side. Mrs. Johnson held Mark's hand tightly, their children close behind, as the reality of their victory began to sink in. They weren't just walking away with a legal win, they were walking away with their dignity intact. "Mr. Green," a reporter called out, pushing a microphone toward him. "What does this victory mean for future cases like this?" David looked down at the family beside him, giving Mrs. Johnson a small, reassuring nod. Then he turned back to the crowd, his voice clear and steady, carrying the weight of justice earned through hard-fought battles. "It means justice," he said firmly, his words cutting through the noise. "Not just for this family, but for all families who've been mistreated. Landlords like Mr. Carson need to understand that there are consequences for their actions. For too long, People in positions of power have gotten away with harassment, discrimination, and abuse. But today, we've shown that those days are coming to an end. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, the cameras clicking with rapid flashes. Another voice rose from the crowd. "Do you think this case will set a precedent?" David gave a measured nod, his gaze unwavering. "It already has. This case sends a message to every landlord, every tenant, and every family who's ever felt powerless. You have the right to be treated with respect and fairness, no matter who you are or where you live. And if someone tries to take that from you, they will be held accountable." Mrs. Johnson squeezed Mark's hand as the words sank in. David wasn't just speaking to the reporters. He was speaking to them, too. He had promised from the start that justice would be served, and he had delivered. She looked at David, gratitude filling her heart. He hadn't just won the case. He had given them their lives back. The crowd continued buzzing with questions, but David kept his focus on the family beside him. This moment wasn't about the spotlight or the headlines. It was about the people standing with him. A final reporter shouted from the back of the crowd, "What do you hope this case changes?" David paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He wanted this moment to mean something, to resonate beyond the courthouse steps. "I hope it reminds people that justice isn't just for those with power, it's for everyone. And when good people stand together, they can push back against injustice and win." The crowd erupted into more questions, but David turned to Mrs. Johnson, offering her his hand. "You ready to go?" Mrs. Johnson gave him a tired but genuine smile. For the first time in a long time, the weight on her shoulders felt light. "More than ready," she said softly. Mark gave David a firm handshake, his gratitude clear in his eyes. "Thank you for everything." David nodded, his expression warm. "You fought hard for this, Mark. You earned it." With the reporters still calling out questions, the Johnsons made their way down the courthouse steps, their children walking close by their side. The sunlight felt different now, brighter, warmer, like a new chapter waiting to be written. As they reached the bottom of the steps, Mrs. Johnson took one last glance back at the courthouse, the place where their fight had ended and their victory had begun. Carson was gone, his power broken, his arrogance reduced to nothing. The damage he had tried to do to them had backfired, and the message was clear. People like him couldn't act without consequence anymore. They stepped onto the sidewalk together, their heads high, their hearts lighter than they had been in months. They had fought. They had won. And now, at last, they were free. The Johnson family returned to their apartment, their footsteps light as they climbed the stairs. The same walls that once felt like a prison now seemed like a place of triumph. This was their home, and it was theirs to keep. As Mark unlocked the door, Mrs. Johnson exhaled deeply, feeling the tension she had carried for months finally dissolve. Victory tasted sweet, but it was the sense of peace that made it truly satisfying. Inside, everything looked just as they had left it. The familiar hum of the fridge, the cozy throw blanket draped over the couch, and the children's toys scattered across the floor. But it felt different now. The apartment was no longer just a place to live. It was a place they had fought for, a symbol of their resilience and dignity. Tia followed her parents into the living room, her eyes bright with curiosity. She had watched her parents fight a battle bigger than anything she had ever imagined, and now that it was over, she had questions. "Do you think Carson will ever try something like this again?" she asked, her voice small but serious. Mrs. Johnson smiled softly and knelt down, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "If he does," she whispered, pressing a kiss to Tia's forehead, "we'll be ready, and so will others." Tia's gaze lingered on her mother's face, absorbing the quiet strength in her words. The fear that had once gripped their family was gone, replaced by something stronger. Hope. Mark set the table for dinner, placing dishes down with care, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. It had been a long road, but they had reached the other side together. He called out to Daniel, who was still playing in the hallway. "Come on, buddy. Time to eat." The family gathered around the table, the familiar clatter of plates and silverware filling the room. It wasn't an elaborate meal, just a simple dinner made with love, but it tasted better than anything they'd eaten in a long time. They sat close together, passing bowls of food, the tension that had once shadowed their meals now replaced by easy laughter and light conversation. Mrs. Johnson looked around the table, her heart full. They had made it through the storm, not just as individuals, but as a family. Every challenge, every moment of fear and doubt had only brought them closer, binding them together with a strength that couldn't be broken. Mark caught her gaze across the table and gave her a knowing smile. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Mrs. Johnson smiled back, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "We did." Tia grinned, reaching for another helping of food. "So, what now?" she asked, the innocence in her question making her parents laugh. Mrs. Johnson looked around at her family, her heart swelling with pride. They had fought for their home, for their dignity, and for each other. And now they were ready to move forward, stronger than ever. "Now?" she said, wrapping her arm around Tia's shoulders. "Now, we live." The family settled into the rhythm of the meal, talking and laughing, the weight of the past finally behind them. They knew the future wasn't guaranteed. There would be challenges, as there always were. But they also knew they were ready for whatever came next. They had proven that together, they could face anything. As the night wore on and the apartment filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking dishes, the Johnson family knew one thing for sure. Their fight had made a difference. Not just for them, but for every family that would come after them, knowing that justice could be won and dignity defended. And as the lights glowed warmly around the dinner table, the Johnsons sat together, united, stronger than before, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together.